The silence was dense, not peaceful, but loaded with that weighty stillness that comes when something sacred has been broken. Nathaniel Nate Carter knelt on the sidewalk, his hands drenched in blood that wasn't his own. Beneath him, Shadow lay still, breathing barely. The dog's chest, once full of vigor and discipline, now struggled with each ragged inhale. Shadow's dark eyes locked on Nate's, trying to read an order, a cue, some command to fix what couldn't be fixed. "Stay with me," Nate whispered. His voice cracked and small. "Just hold on, boy," a few feet away. The two officers stood still, their fingers grazing their holsters with practiced detachment. One of them muttered more to himself than anyone else. Should have had that thing on a shorter leash? Nate didn't. Answer, he couldn't. The world had tilted. The routine was broken, and Shadow, his companion, his brother in more ways than most would understand, was dying, rewind to the day before, and Nate was just another man on just another block, blending into the background like wallpaper. In this gentrifying stretch just outside Washington, D.C., most neighbors didn't know his name, but they knew his routine. Twice a day, like clockwork, he walked his dog, a proud, muscular Belgian Malinois, that seemed more like an extension of Nate himself than a pet. They moved together like a quiet force, disciplined and in sync, the kind of presence that turned heads not because they demanded attention, but because they carried a certain weight. Most called him the dog guy, but no one knew the full story, no. One knew that Nate had once been part of the most elite protection detail in the country, a covert arm of the Secret Service tasked with impossible missions in impossible places. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. In fact, he was never supposed to be seen. But in Kabul years ago, he had pulled the President of the United States from the ruins of a smoking motorcade. Shielding him from a second wave of attack, Shadow had taken down the would-be assassin before he reached the extraction point. Together, they'd defied odds that should have left them in body bags. The photos were never released, the mission redacted from every public record. The only thing Nate kept was the dog. After retiring, Nate had withdrawn from the noise. No accolades, no interviews, no thank you speeches. He chose peace, or at least what passed for it. A modest home, quiet days, black coffee, books he actually read, and a dog who never left his side. And yet, despite his silence, despite his efforts to blend in, he felt the eyes. Neighbors who clutched purses tighter when he passed, strangers who refused to meet his gaze, the subtle tightening of shoulders when he and Shadow turned a corner. Nate had been trained to spot threats in deserts, jungles, and war zones. But this soft, persistent suspicion was harder to trace, yet just as hostile. That evening, the sun hung low, dripping gold through tree branches, painting the street in gentle light. It was supposed to be one of those quiet end-of-summer walks. Nate in a faded jacket, Shadow at his side, until the cruiser rolled around the corner. Even before it stopped, Nate felt it. That change in pressure like a storm was coming. Two white officers stepped out. One leaned against the open car door, the other already walking with deliberate steps. "Evening," the driver said. Casual on the surface, but carrying something underneath. Nate nodded politely. "Good evening, officers. You live around here?" the second asked. "Yes, just down the block," Nate replied calmly. "Strange," the driver muttered. "Don't think I've seen you before. I've been away. I work in international security. Just got back." That word security never landed well. It unsettled people, especially those who already assumed too much. The officer smirked. "Private security, huh? Sounds like a fancy word for mercenary." Nate let out a soft chuckle, unbothered. "Consulting mostly. Risk assessment, emergency response. I train teams, not lead them." The taller one crossed his arms. "We got a call. Suspicious individual walking. With a large dog. Didn't know a walk counted as suspicious," Nate said. Still steady, still measured. The other officer stepped closer to Shadow, who stood calm, ears perked, but tail relaxed. "Big dog. Is he trained?" "Extensively," Nate answered. "For what?" "For obedience, protection if necessary." The air shifted again. The officers exchanged a look. One of them nodded toward Nate's pocket. "Let's see some ID." Nate considered it. He had rights. He knew them better than most, but rights don't always protect you. Not when the men with guns have already decided how the story ends. So he moved slowly, deliberately, his voice low. Sure. As he reached for his wallet, Shadow moved slightly with him, just enough to draw attention. "Watch your dog," one officer snapped. "He's fine," Nate said. "He's trained to mirror me." They weren't. Listening, they didn't want calm. They wanted control. Nate handed over his ID. The officer barely looked at it before gesturing toward the car. "We're going to need to ask you some more questions." "I've answered enough," Nate replied. "Then you won't mind coming over here." "I do mind. I haven't done anything wrong." "That was it, the line." The shorter officer took a step, his voice sharp. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Shadow shifted again, more alert this time, instinctively placing himself between Nate and the threat. A growl rose, not aggressive, just a warning. And that's when the gun came up. The shot cracked the evening silence like glass. Shadow dropped instantly. Nate didn't move, not to attack, not to run. He fell to his knees. The leash went slack. The blood pooled fast. His hands reached to cradle the dog's side, pressing uselessly against the wound. He whispered his name. Once, twice, over and over. Later in the station, he sat beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, the scent of dried blood still clinging to his sleeves. The officers filed their reports. No charges, no apologies, just cold protocol. Then a new voice entered. Sharp, female, furious. "Let him go now." Mariana Carter didn't wait for permission. She was all fire and steel, a federal prosecutor in heels and a tailored suit, storming into the room with authority no one dared challenge. "You shot his dog and arrested him for what?" Walking while black, her voice cut through the room like a blade. Nate didn't speak until they were outside. The stars overhead blurred. His voice was low, tired. They didn't even look at him. He was just a threat. Mariana touched his shoulder. "We'll file complaints. I'll call in favors." Nate shook his head. "They'll bury it like they always do." Back home, he sat alone beside the empty bed where Shadow used to sleep. The collar still smelled like him. He ran his thumb along the worn leather, each scuff a memory. The first mission. The night Shadow alerted him to a tripwire. The time he pulled Nate out of the rubble. They hadn't just killed a dog. They'd killed the last part of his old life that still made sense. The next morning, Nate stood in the mirror, his reflection calm but unreadable. He picked up the collar and wrapped it slowly around his hand. It felt like a weapon, or a promise. They didn't know who he was, but they would. And this time, he wasn't going to disappear quietly. The morning after Shadow's death, the neighborhood was eerily silent, as if the trees and houses themselves were holding their breath. Nate Carter sat in his kitchen, untouched toast cooling beside a steaming cup of black coffee he hadn't sipped. His fingers moved slowly over Shadow's collar, running along the rough leather, the metal tag still clinking faintly. Everything in his home was in its place, the books arranged by subject, the floor swept, blinds half-drawn as always. But it no longer felt like home. It felt like a memory someone had forgotten to close the door on. Mariana had called 3 times since sunrise. Each time he let the phone ring until the screen went dark. He didn't have the words yet. Not for her. Not for anyone. What he did have was clarity. A kind he hadn't felt since his last deployment. Clarity is dangerous in a man trained to fight. But in a man who has already given everything once and lost what little he had left, it's a flame. That evening, Nate sat in the shadows of a small bar on the east side of town, nursing a club soda, eyes fixed on the man laughing near the end of the counter, Officer Roberto Hayes. Roberto, one of the two who had stood over Shadows, body like it was trash in the street, now sat with his back to the world, carefree, as if the incident had never happened. He slapped the bartender on the back, flirted loudly with a woman half his age, downed shots like someone who believed the law would always shield him. Nate had been watching for 3 days. Roberto kept the same habits, drank too much, took the same alley to the back lot, parked where the cameras didn't reach. Too easy. But this wasn't about violence. Not yet. It was about fear. A reminder that not all men could be stepped on without consequence. When Roberto stumbled out the back door just after midnight, Nate was already there, leaning against the bricks, hood pulled low. Roberto fumbled with his keys, cursed under his breath, then froze when a voice cut through the dark like gravel. "You ever wonder what it's like to be hunted, officer?" Roberto turned, squinting into the shadows, but the strike came too fast. Not with a weapon, with a message, a blow to the gut, a twist of the wrist, a quick trip to the concrete. Nate knelt close, speaking into the man's ear with a voice cold. "As Winter, I'm not here to kill you. I'm here to introduce you to something you don't recognize. Accountability?" And then he was gone. Silent, clean, leaving only bruises and fear behind. The next morning, the news made its quiet rounds in law enforcement circles. An unknown assailant had attacked an officer. No cameras, no witnesses, Roberto claimed it. Was a gang hit, but his eyes, wild and darting, said otherwise. Nate watched from a distance just outside the frame as the department scrambled. The attack had unsettled them. That was the point. But Nate wasn't satisfied. Fear was only the beginning. He returned home that night and began assembling what he called the grid. A web of names, locations, evidence, and patterns. Every excessive force complaint tied to those. 2 officers. Every man they'd hurt. Every woman who'd tried to speak up and been ignored. He found old court documents, cell phone videos buried in cloud drives, witness statements that had never made it to trial. His house became part war room, part sanctuary. Shadow's collar remained on the table, a silent witness to every plan, every strategy. Meanwhile, Mariana pushed for justice the old-fashioned way. She filed a formal complaint, pushed media contacts, reached out to watchdog groups, but her calls were returned slowly, if at all. The system moved at a crawl, if it moved at all. "They've already closed the internal investigation," she told Nate during a tense visit. "They cleared both officers. They called it a threat misjudged in the field." Nate said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was its own statement. Days later, Nate followed the second officer, Luis Moreno, through his routine. Luis was smarter, less flashy than Roberto. He kept to himself, but he had a pattern too. Nate tailed him through back streets and private gyms, cafes where he met with others who wore the same badge but shared the same arrogance. Nate recorded everything. He planted a small device on Luis's car, just enough to track routes, not invade privacy. He wasn't breaking the law, not yet. But every step brought him closer to the line. Then the twist, one of the men Luis met with, a former boxing coach named Marcos, was someone Nate recognized, not from service, but from the community. A man who once stood up to police after being beaten during a wrongful arrest. His case had been dismissed, his voice silenced. Nate approached him one evening outside the gym. No threats, no bravado, just a question. "If you had the chance to be heard again, would you take it?" Marcos looked at him, eyes narrowing. "Depends who's listening." Nate handed him a USB drive. "They will be soon." That night, Marcos's story went live, raw, unedited, filmed in the dim light of Nate's study, filled with quiet rage and truth. The video went viral within hours. Mariana called in shock. "What did you do?" Nate simply replied, gave them something to feel. The department scrambled, public statements, half-hearted apologies, but nothing concrete, no action. Nate knew it was time to push harder. He baited Luis and Roberto into showing up at his home. Under false pretenses, just a friendly visit, they claimed. He left the gate unlocked, left documents on the table, made the space look vulnerable. He let them shove him, let them speak threats into the silence, let the cameras hidden behind vents and light fixtures record every second. When they left, laughing, thinking they had reasserted dominance, Nate uploaded the footage, not to the news, to the world. By morning, the story had turned. Not just another black man complaining about police, but a former elite agent. A man who had once stood between the president and death. A man who had been silent for too long and now had proof. The footage aired nationwide. Luis and Roberto were suspended within hours. Investigations reopened. Protests began. Not angry, but resolute. Nate watched from his porch, arms crossed, Shadow's collar in his palm. When Mariana arrived, tears in her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. They had both chosen different paths to justice. But now, for the first time, those paths had met. This world had changed. In a matter of days, what began as a silent, solitary act of mourning had grown into a movement. Nate Carter's footage spread across networks and social media like wildfire. Not just because of what it showed, but because of who he was. It wasn't just the image of a decorated veteran pushed against his wall by two arrogant officers. It was the contrast. A man who had once shielded the President of the United States, now needing protection from the very law he had once trusted with his life. The public listened. Veterans spoke up. Journalists dug deeper. Names came out. Cases reopened. Suddenly, people who had been invisible were seen. But Nate hadn't done this to go viral. He had done it because they killed his friend, and he knew that justice doesn't knock unless you open the door, and sometimes it has to be kicked open. The courtroom was colder than expected, modern, sterile, and humming with restrained tension. Nate sat quietly near the front, not as a defendant or even a witness that day, but as a presence, a reminder. He wore a charcoal suit, pressed and plain, but the real armor was in his posture, still steady, undeniable. Mariana stood beside him, flipping through documents, her face unreadable, but burning with controlled purpose. Across the room, Luis and Roberto shifted in their seats. They looked different now, not confident or smug, but weathered. Public shame does that to a man. When their names were read aloud and charges listed, unlawful conduct, abuse of power, civil rights violations, they flinched. Not because they hadn't expected it, but because they no longer believed they were untouchable. Nate didn't celebrate. This wasn't victory. This was accountability. A first step. Justice, in his experience, was rarely swift and never clean. It was a series of heavy, painful corrections dragged across weeks, months, years. But this was something. It was happening. When the judge called for a recess, Nate stepped outside, letting the sunlight touch his face. The crowd outside the courthouse cheered when they saw him, and he nodded politely, but didn't raise his hand. He wasn't there for applause. He was thinking of Shadow, how his ears would twitch when the wind shifted, how he would sit perfectly, still beside Nate at any public gathering, like a soldier awaiting orders. He felt the absence like a hole in his chest, but the warmth of that memory, even in sorrow, grounded him. Later that evening, back home, Nate sat in his study and opened an envelope that had been delivered quietly earlier that day. Inside was a formal letter stamped with the seal of the United States government, a commendation, belated but sincere. Recognizing his actions years ago in Afghanistan during the mission that had saved the president's life, the letter closed with a line that read, "We regret that this honor comes so late. Some heroes serve in silence. Others rise when called upon." Again, Nate set it aside. He didn't need medals. He never had. But there was something poetic about receiving that letter now after everything. That night, Mariana joined him for dinner. They ate in relative silence, two people finally breathing easier. She looked around the house, noting its sparseness. "You've never changed this place much," she said. Nate smiled faintly. Didn't feel the need to. Shadow didn't mind. Her expression softened. "What are you going to do now?" Nate leaned back in his chair. "There's something I've been thinking about." 2 weeks later, in a quiet corner lot just outside the city, construction began on a modest facility. Nothing flashy, no signs screaming patriotism or vengeance, just a clean, functional space with open grounds and reinforced training areas. It would be a center for training service dogs, real ones for veterans suffering from trauma, for first responders recovering from injuries, for those who needed more than therapy. It would be named the Shadow Program. Not after the pain, but after the loyalty, the bond, the protection without conditions. Nate didn't announce it on television. He didn't give interviews, but word spread and slowly people came. Some brought dogs who had lost their way. Others brought memories they hadn't spoken aloud in years. They came because they recognized in Nate something they had almost forgotten. Strength without noise, leadership without ego, grief without surrender. Meanwhile, the legal process continued. Mariana pressed forward, ensuring that the system didn't just bury things again. She worked behind the scenes, gathering others, activists, lawyers, journalists, who now saw an opportunity to push for broader reform. Nate supported her. But from a distance, his days were filled with the rhythm of work, training, structure, sweat. At night, he sat with a quiet mug of tea and watched the stars, wondering if somewhere beyond the silence, Shadow was still keeping watch. Months passed. A verdict came. Both officers were found guilty, not just of misconduct, but of systemic abuse, negligence, and falsification of reports. Their sentences were not as long as some would have wanted, but they were real. Their names would no longer be whispered with fear, but remembered for the line they crossed and the man who drew it back on the 1-year anniversary of Shadow's death. Nate held a small gathering at the training center. Former trainees came. Families who had adopted service dogs through the program stood with pride. Mariana gave a short speech, voice strong and even. But it was Nate who, standing last, held the collar in his hand and said the words that truly mattered. This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. It's about never letting someone tell you that you or those you love don't matter. Shadow stood beside me every day, never asking for praise, only doing his job. This is for him, and for anyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or forgotten. You are not alone. When the applause faded, a quiet hush settled over the group. Not mournful, but powerful, they understood. Because what Nate had done wasn't just about reclaiming dignity. It was about restoring it for everyone like him. Those who had served, sacrificed, and returned to a world that didn't see them. Now, at least in this corner of it, they were seen, heard, valued. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned the soft orange of closure, Nate walked the outer grounds of the center. A new pup trotted beside him, ears too big for its head, eyes full of promise. He wasn't replacing Shadow, no one ever could. But he was opening the door again, to healing, to purpose, to tomorrow. And tomorrow was waiting.